We discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jack.
And I am Priscilla Jenny Mambella. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a noonday broadcast where we delve into transformative dialogues about social justice and the voices leading the charge for social reforms. Here at a noonday, we explore the intersections of politics, culture, and tradition with the leaders who are reshaping our world for the better. A noonday focuses on critical dialogues around social justice with emphasis on gender justice to influence policies and contribute to societal shifts. Today we have Madam Elizabeth Estabrooks, who is a retired executive and she now volunteers and writes. Before retiring, Liz served as the Deputy Director at the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA Center for Women Veterans, CWV, in Washington, D.C., where she operated as the subject matter expert on women veteran issues, concerns, and needs both within and outside VA, speaking in favor of changes that improved safety and equity for women veterans. Liz was the lead on organizational and strategic planning. She led the development and implementation of new initiatives to support and enhance CWV's vision and mission, and worked with researchers to lead the production of two congressionally mandated studies. One, the study on the unemployment rate of post 9/11 women veterans, and two, the prevalence of intimate partner violence in the veteran population. Liz was the VA lead on developing a first ever VA women veteran survey to identify and understand low rates of VA benefits and healthcare usage by women. Thank you for joining us today. It's so great to have you, Liz.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Priscilla. Thank you for having me and for all the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's good to be connected to you, and thank you too for all the work you do. So I was reading about what you've been doing for the last 1 year, because I know I think it was a year and a half ago or two. I don't remember exactly now, but I approached you to give me some ideas because we were trying to, I was tasked or asked by my executive director to come up with ideas on how to improve our services for female veterans. So I reached out to you for ideas, and then I've been following your work since then. So I'm so glad that we get to talk about some of the amazing things you do out there. So thank you for joining us today.
I'm happy to.
Yeah. Yeah, so audience, this is a let me give you a little idea, a little bit of information. Liz profile is long. I'm going to share the link so that you can check her out, and also check her out on LinkedIn as well. I'm going to share her profile. Um, but yeah, so she has written a memoir that spans her life from joining the army in 1977 through her exit from the Department of Veterans Affairs in 2022, which was followed by a solo 1 year van trip across the United States. Based on her experience and knowledge gained from spending almost 30 years working with women survivors of domestic and sexual violence, civilian and veterans, the book examines post traumatic stress and re traumatization among women survivors of interpersonal violence, weaving all of that in with her own life experiences professionally and personally. The book is titled Broken in the Stronger Places, From Resilience to Resourcefulness, and it's going to be released on March 18, right before sexual assault. I mean, in Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And Liz, it was from you that I learned, as I was reading, that I learned there is a difference between resourcefulness and resilience. So maybe we should start with that. I thought that was an eye-opening moment for me. As you talk to us about that, let me just first ask you this question.
Sure.
Um, you say you were talking to a group of I was reading on your website. I'm going to share the link. And you share how you were talking to this group about your book. And while you were talking about re traumatization in this book being the primary thing, and then you said, more specifically, re traumatization is not discussed enough by mental health or other providers. What we hear from professionals is that with the right work and tools combined with our resilience, we can learn to overcome and lessen the impact of trauma, even though it stays with us. The unintended outcome of that missing part of the conversation is that for those of us who have PTS, we don't think about the reality of re traumatization and how it can break us even in our stronger places. How do we prepare for and manage it when it comes? I know you asked that question, but I'm throwing it back at you.
No, it's a great question, and I'm glad we're starting with that. I have an MSW, and I started in the field in 1993, and I preparing for re-traumatization is something that we as advocates don't think about. As social workers and mental health providers, we don't really prepare people for that. And for me, it's that resourcefulness piece. Resilience can carry us through trauma repeatedly, but it's that resourcefulness, having knowing what to do when you break, knowing what is it that's going to help put me back together. Resourcefulness could be something like seeking out your support group, your best friend. It could be what my act was to get in my van and do a solo trip for a year, over a year. And I was 10 months in my van, and then another like 5 or 6 months in my Jeep driving around. And that was what healed me when I broke in my stronger places. And so it's really about knowing what as a person, as an individual, what is it that you need to do in order to seek that healing. It could be I met a woman, and I talk about this in my book, who what she does is she gets in her vehicle, in her camper, and she goes away for 3 days, and she doesn't tell anyone where she is. She just goes and she spends that 3 days sort of rehealing. And so it resourcefulness is knowing, having the tools, knowing you have those tools, and then knowing to use those tools when that happens. So often, especially when working with women who are survivors, that trauma can become so overwhelming, and I've known some women who, frankly, I've been surprised that they've lived through the trauma they have lived through. And then but they have found ways, they have resilience, and then they have found ways to be resourceful, to use their resources and their tools to move through it when it happens again.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I should have started with that, but that re-traumatization part stood out for me because I agree with it. We don't um we don't talk about that much.
No.
Yeah, we do not. And then I think sometimes we want to move past it fast or ignore it
Yeah.
or but it does happen. And we need to talk about trauma in order to, because to heal we need to just to have the conversation. But during that conversation, yeah, you become re-traumatized, especially if your mind has buried the trauma, and you know you didn't revisit it all along. There is this popular book that when I came to the US, that was the first book that gave me this aha moment. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And then you
Yes, it's a
realize,
great
oh
book.
my God, yeah, so we really do pass around here, move around with trauma in us because we don't do not talk about those things. Does not mean they go away. They remain in us. So people like you or mental health practitioner trying to get us to have conversation about our trauma issue, there will be re-traumatization, and that is not something that we usually acknowledge. So to it stood out for me when I read it in your work. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome, and I'm glad you said that because there was an approach to trauma recovery and therapy for a long time that said you have to talk about the details, you have to talk about the incident, and that's how you get through it. And now we've come to a place, thankfully, where we recognize that re-traumatizes people, and it's not the best approach. Having people sit and recite and recount their trauma experience can cause harm, and it's unintentional. And certainly it was a well-intended approach to therapy, but thankfully we've learned that that's not necessarily. And I remember one of the first therapists I saw about mine, she said that she wanted me to go into a group that was all male veterans, and because that was the base of my trauma mostly. And I got to the door that day. I was a therapy dropout for a while because I got to the
Mm,
door that day and I couldn't go in. Everything in me was rising up against that. And I knew that I could not go in that room and sit there with those men, and I fled. I turned around and I literally fled, and I sent her a message and I said, that's not an experiment we can try a second time. We have to do
yeah,
something else. And she said, well, it's not for everyone. And I said, well, no. And I met so many women, especially women veterans over the year, because when you go through the process of getting your service connected benefits, for a long time you have to talk about the incident, and for a long time you were required to talk about the details of the incident. They no longer require that, thankfully. But so many women veterans, like so many non-veterans, stuff that thing. They think, if I just escape from it, if I just leave, if I leave, I will be okay. If I, I'm done now, it happened, I've put it beside me, or it's behind me, and I'll be okay. But it's always in there, and it's always waiting, and it's always impacting your life, and how you parent, how you are friends, how you are an employee. It impacts every facet of your life every day without you even recognizing how impactful that is in your present, even if it happened 40 or 50 years ago.
I agree. I agree. It impacts how you show up. So let's go back. Let's go to the beginning. What inspired you to be? You mentioned that in passing a few times, but I would, if you're okay with sharing, just feel free to share what's comfortable for you, Liz. And let me just say out there for our audience, this conversation might be triggering for some people because we're going to be talking about MST. We're going to be talking about yes. So military sexual trauma, and we're going to be talking about domestic violence. We may be talking about sexual trauma or sexual violence or sexual harassment. So just so you know, audience, yeah, this is the kind of conversation we're going to be having. Liz, please tell us again if you're comfortable with what inspired you to read Booking in a Stronger Places. I know your journey includes time in a military and your inform your work in advocacy and all of that. So, do you mind sharing with us your experience in the military?
No, I don't mind. Thank you. So when I joined in 1977, women were still only a small percentage of the military, and President Carter was working to increase the number of women. And the draft, after the draft ended, enlistments in the military, people didn't want to volunteer because they were like, I don't want to go to war. I'm not going to volunteer for the military, because it had always been the draft. And women, except for women who weren't drafted, we had always, since the American Revolution, we had always volunteered. And so all 3 million women who have served in the military have volunteered for that service, even in the worst of times, during Vietnam, during World War II, during the worst of times, women have always volunteered. And of course, since the draft ended, so have men. But women were still fairly new and unwelcome in the military in 1977 and 1978. And there were the different women divisions. There was the Women's Army Corps WACS, there was Waves, which was Navy, there were the SPARs, which were Coast Guard. And those were kind of, those were the women sections of the military. And so in 1976, they started the process of dismantling the Women's Army Corps and integrating women into regular Army. And there were thousands and thousands of jobs closed to us when I joined, just because we were women. But when I was doing my research for the book, I came across a report that was conducted by the Department of Defense post-Vietnam, when they were trying to figure out how the hell they were going to get people to enlist, right? And one of the things that they said, and these were their words, was that they realized that they had a choice, because enlistment among men was falling so dramatically, and quality men weren't enlisting, but quality women were wanting to enlist. So the question before them was do we start recruiting and going after actively recruiting women who are quality women, or do we continue to go after low quality men? And the obvious answer was high quality women. And so they started increasing, doing whatever they could to increase the number of women who were willing to enlist in the military. And so when I went in, I was the second wave of women to go through co-ed after they had begun dismantling. Women had always gone to basic training in Fort McClellan, women only, not with men. And so I went in, and our first day, you go and you're on the bus with the men and the women, and you're rallying, and you get off, and they start screaming at you. The drill sergeants start yelling at you, and they tell you to get in formation. And so we were standing there, the men and the women, and the drill sergeants who were lined up in front of us said, look to your left, look to your right, look to your front, look to your back. This is your family. These are your brothers and sisters. We are your mommies and daddies. We're all here together. And the very next breath, they said, and for you females out there, and they had a very, very derogatory way of saying the word female. We knew it was an insult. They said, for you females out there, know that we do not believe you belong in this man's army. And we are going to spend the next 8 weeks showing you just how much we believe that. And if we have anything to do with it, not one of you will make it through basic training. And in those moments, as I looked back on it, I realized how that shifted the way the men looked at us. We had been othered by the drill sergeants. The men had been told, these women are interlopers, they don't belong. We had been told, you don't belong, and we're going to make your lives miserable. So that was my introduction into the U.S. military. And for the next 3 years, it was what I always say, it was unending sexual assault. If I was in uniform and on base, at work, anywhere, I was being harassed and grabbed and groped and dealing with all of that. And I didn't realize until much later, until 40 years later, that, or not quite 40, maybe 30, that how that had impacted me, that I had post-traumatic stress, that I had what they call military sexual trauma from those 3 years of nonstop, day in, day out harassment. And so I got out of the military. I spent 10 years in the banking and insurance field. And then I went into the field of domestic violence and sexual assault. And I stayed there from 1993. I stayed there until I retired, working in that field, doing research, working with survivors and victims, and it I began experiencing vicarious trauma. And for the listeners there who don't know, vicarious trauma, it happens oftentimes with helpers, with first responders, with advocates, with people who interact with people who have been in traumatic situations, hearing those stories, seeing the outcomes, and it's called vicarious trauma. And so I didn't realize how my vicarious trauma was growing and building over the years, and it was. And so, and I go into that in some detail in the book. I didn't go to my first therapy for post-traumatic stress until like 2006, 2000. Well, no, I think it was more about 2015, the first time I saw a therapist for it, because I'd been putting it off. I had been saying to myself over those decades, I'm busy. I've got to do this work. These women need me. I have to keep it together. I have to put more lacquer and more gold on my broken places. And I'll interject here that the title "Broken in the Stronger Places" is in my background. You can see the cover art. It's based on kintsugi, and kintsugi, for the listeners, is I'm sure you've seen the art. It's a Japanese technique of repairing porcelain and others. Yeah, and so you use lacquer and gold over the top of it. And so what they have said over the decades about kintsugi is that because of those repairs, that piece becomes stronger in their broken places. And in the early 90s, the field of mental health adopted that and said, oh, if you do the recovery and the therapy and the CB, all this stuff, you too will be stronger in your broken places. And so what I learned over my decades of my own trauma and working with others is that we as women, and I only worked with women. Women that's the sum of my experience, that we spend a lifetime putting lacquer and gold over our broken places so that we can carry on, so we can do the work, so we can raise the kids, keep the house, go to work, do the education, do all the things we need to do. We learn, we become experts at kintsugi in our lives, putting that lacquer and gold over our broken places. And I came to understand that was that theoretical narrative, that theory about becoming stronger in the broken places was a false narrative, that we can break in those stronger places, and we do. And that's re-traumatization, that constantly being told that we can be stronger if we do this. It'll all be better. We'll be fine. You'll be fine. You're fine. You're fine. You're just fine. You're fine. All's good. You're fine. But the fact is that we are breaking on a regular basis in those stronger places when things happen. And so that was when I was at VA, it got very awful. My integrity was challenged because I was looking out at the leaders at VA and understanding that they had no idea what they were doing, that they were causing so much harm to women veterans that it was almost unspeakable. And I was becoming more and more broken because I'm trying to help these women who are survivors. And the VA has, for instance, I found out when I was at VA, because we had a woman who was severely traumatized and harmed, and she was then assaulted by a medical provider at the Atlanta VA. And the deputy secretary at the time said that they didn't fire medical providers who sexually assaulted women or veterans as long as those providers continue to hold their state license. And my boss said it was our job at the Center for Women Veterans to make sure we changed the policy. And she said, I can't, it's not my job. There's nothing I can do about it. And I just sort of shattered in that moment. And finally in September when I left, I realized I was so broken. I was so damaged and destroyed. And that job had really it had piled onto all of those years of trauma and vicarious and otherwise. And I just snapped. And that was when I left VA, and I got in my van and I drove bought a van and drove for 10 months.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh wow. No, I understand. Because it comes through your writings, again, like I said, yeah, at the beginning, I've been following you for the past almost 2 years now. And it comes through your writing, your frustration with the system, the VA and the way they treat women veterans, and your advocacy for, especially you've been vocal and you still are on racial discrimination as well. Um, so one would think that you were even, a black person, but that goes to show your genuineness in advocating for people who are mistreated by the system and discriminated against. So yeah, that's when I became really attracted to your work. Um,
Oh, thank you.
Tell us, you mentioned in passing about the, how do you say, kintsugi? How does that concept of kintsugi, embracing brokenness as part of strength, apply to survivors?
So I think there is a place for kintsugi. I think there's a place for that theory because that because the therapy that we go to, the things that we access in order to heal can serve as lacquer and gold, and they can help strengthen our broken places. But I think that the important thing, and this is what I always say, if we put trauma on a continuum like this, and we say this is where the trauma happened, and then this is like the recovery, the therapy and the other things that we do to recover. But what we don't explore as mental health providers and as a field is this part. We don't explore, like, there's such a thing as post-traumatic growth, and there's people can and may continue to do therapy, but this is where re-traumatization lives, and we don't explore this. We say, yes, you can become stronger in your broken places right here. This is it. This is the key. But what we have to add is
Mm,
understanding re-traumatization,
yeah,
understanding the damage it can do, and understanding that if we don't talk about that as mental health providers, we're not giving our people, our survivors, the tools
oh,
they need.
mm,
Because then when re-traumatization happens, and I've spoken to several women after talking about my book who've said, oh my God, it's, because we, as women especially, we always think, oh, I'm a failure, I suck, I'm a terrible employee, I'm a terrible mother. Like, we are very quick to denigrate ourselves. And so we think, oh, I'm a failure at therapy, I'm not doing it right, I'm doing something wrong. And so I think that if we start having these conversations about re-traumatization and resourcefulness and getting through re-traumatization, and yes, you can be stronger in your broken places, but at the same time, you can break there. Something can happen to you, whether it's a national event or whether it's a personal event. Something can happen to you that can break your stronger places. And
mhm.
how do we fix that? How do we address that when it happens and not be set back in a way that causes more harm?
Yeah, yeah. Les, you mentioning the things you're talking about just resonate in a lot of ways. And I will come to the question of, now, since you've worked with thousands of survivors, what are the most common barriers you face when seeking support? But before you respond to that, I just wanted to say why, what I want to say, that most of what you're talking about keep resonating with me, and I don't want to become too personal in sharing, but yeah, one of the ones maybe that I share with you is running away from therapy, especially when it came to certain area aspect of my trauma that I wasn't prepared to visit. That was, yeah, after a year of therapy in 2020, of just working through DV issues. And then I thought I was prepared, or the therapist thought I was prepared for the next stage, which had to do with child, you know, and but then I stopped. I just, yeah, I wasn't ready to go into that area. Um, so I agree. Again, that's what the issue of re-traumatization, because I've had this argument or conversation with a few people, not wanting to be specific with who they are, but in the same VA cycle, it was like, well, if they don't want to, they have to fill in a form, or they have to explain in detail, about what happened. You can't claim service connection, and then you don't want to share what happened. And I'm like, that's the only way the VA can pay you. I say, but then we have to revisit this system. We have to change that system,
Yeah.
because I don't know who are those that came up with that policy, whether they are people who are survivors or victims of trauma. Because if they are, they will understand that trauma is not a joyride. The things that people try to bury, in a trauma, it's
Yeah.
not something they want to just sit in someone's office and read about just because they want benefit. Um, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
no, nobody wants to visit something that, and they're like, well,
Oh,
that's the only way the story will be believable. How they don't just hand out, yeah, that taxpayer money to. I say we have to continue to have this conversation for us to rework these policies, especially when it comes to trauma issue, when it comes to survivors of MST. And our problem with even making this thing to sound so fancy with the MST, people were sexually abused. Let's call it what it is. What the
mhm.
nonsense about
Yes.
MST
Oh my gosh.
and
Yes.
military sexual to do. Yeah, I always push back at that when we're having our conversation. I'm like, I mean, I feel sick all the time to see the level of, again, that's why I read it through your work, because sometimes it just gets to me that the level of trauma that happened in the Mediterranean, I'm like, how come the system created an avenue or corridor for people to be broken like this to the extent? Because this is not a one or two cases. This is like it was systemic. How did
It's
women get
absolutely.
subjected to this kind of level of trauma?
How did they what?
No, I like, how did women just get subjected to this kind of
Oh,
level of trauma? And someone say it's now that we're trying to pay off people, and even that you're making it hard, you're making it
it's a.
difficult.
I think you landed on it when you said it's systemic. It's a systemic system of racism and sexism and
And
misogyny.
sexism.
It's and sexism, and that culture allows for that. I've had conversations with people a lot. They say, well, it happens to men too. Yes, it does. But when it happens to men, and for the men listening, i I hope I don't trigger you, but for men who are sexually assaulted, oftentimes there are feminine pejoratives used during that act. They call them bitch, pussy. It's about power. Sexual assault has nothing to do with horny men. It has to do with power. It has to do with control. It's a power play, and men who are sexually assaulted, oftentimes it's because they're not viewed as macho enough. They don't meet that male standard, and women don't meet that standard. And we are othered. It's like I was talking about when I went into the military. We have a huge culture around the world of sexual assault. Everywhere you go, it's unfortunate, but it's not ever been seen as important enough to do something about. Um, and we hear that when people talk about women have always been to blame. What did you wear? What were you drinking? What did you do? What did you say? He was your partner. It wasn't until the 90s, I think it was, that women who were sexually assaulted by their husbands had any legal recourse. And and i and so we are fighting a culture, and I always say the military is a microcosm of our culture. If the military were to come to the belief system that it's not okay, that they need to do something about it could change. And here's an example I used years ago. Um, the military, people say, well, the military can't make it stop. Sure they can. Sure they can.
Yes, we
But the
can.
military doesn't want, they can make people do anything they want because they're the military. And I used this example years ago. I said, if the US military determined that they wanted everybody's left boot to be purple and everybody's right boot to be green, they would say, here's the new policy, here's the paint. By this date, your left boot will be purple and your right boot will be green. Go. And then in the days before that final date, that everybody in the chain of command would be saying, has this been done? Have your troops done this? Is it done? And the sergeants, the platoon sergeants and leaders would start saying, have you got this done? If you don't have this done, you're going to be on extra duty. And then on Monday morning, on that date, when at inspection, anybody who didn't have their left boot painted purple and their right boot painted green would be in trouble. And that would be everybody in the military that would apply to the Department of Defense would make sure it happened. And that sounds like a simple, stupid analogy, but if the military chose to do everything in their power to stop sexual assault, to hold the rapists accountable, and let's be clear, let's be very clear about something. Oftentimes we blame the men who are the lower, the E5s, E4s, and lower. This is happening in huge numbers by people who are in your chain of command, who are the E7s and E8s and higher, who are the officers. It's happening unchecked in the academies.
Unchecked.
The military chooses to, unchecked. The military chooses to allow this to continue. Several years ago, when Secretary Austin was talking about it was never going to happen in his military again, within just a couple of months, there was a guy who was an officer. I can't remember what his rank was. He was a colonel or something, who had been accused of sexual assault. He didn't go to jail. It wasn't treated as a crime. Instead, he got to retire, keep his rank, keep everything. Now, what kind of a message did that send to everybody in the military, including the officers, that nothing will happen to you? Nothing happens. There's so few convictions, so few arrests, so few. And in the early 2000s, I read a paper that in the early 2000s, and I discovered that this is the truth. The U.S. military started allowing waivers for men who had committed sex offenses and domestic violence. That there is an allowance for that. So they were intentionally putting these offenders into the military, and it just lends itself to a culture of we don't care what happens to people, how people are victimized in this military. So instead of being a microcosm of a culture that could change, they choose not to change.
Yeah. Put people in a system. People who are serving this country, and you don't create any system of check and balance to protect them.
That's right. And it's, people too often think of it as an individual issue, but it's actually a military readiness issue. It impacts our military readiness. If you are a survivor or a victim, you have to, no matter what, you have to be able to trust the people around you. If you've been betrayed by people in your chain of command and by the organization, if you've been sexually assaulted, you're not going to have that trust.
No.
So,
and another aspect of that, I think, is also a re-traumatization technique. Maybe it's not a technique, but they don't understand that's the impact or effect it has, is that thing of denying people, an MST survivor decide to come forward. And I'm not saying everyone. I don't even like to acknowledge the fact that, there are people who make up story, because that's just a new portion. You can't. Yeah, I'm not going to. So, but the thing about a survivor coming forward, you know, taking our courage to come forward and say, I'm a survivor, MST, and then gets denied by the VA because, oh, you did
Yeah.
not explain the story enough. Like, again, you did not revisit. They don't say revisit, but it like you did not um, provide the actual facts. Forgetting to realize that with those kind of things, sometimes people don't remember the details because the mind, again, in trauma, the mind is
Yeah.
altered, and people do not remember details because the mind does not want to. I mean, they need to. I don't know what kind of trauma expert that look into those cases, but then they deny people, and I think just send people spiraling back into, depression or something.
Absolutely, you're spot on with everything you just said. It's so detrimental. And I have some veteran service officers I've worked with in Oregon who were brilliant, and they tried to teach other veteran service officers, you do not need to make this person tell their story. All we need is high level facts. Here's, I was sexually assaulted at this point by this person. You don't have to go into detail. And the most important thing is what we can do to provide something. Like, for instance, one of the very first cases I worked on here in Oregon with a woman veteran, she had no proof, and that's what for a long time kept women from getting, there was that proof. And but what we looked for was what we called markers, right? So I looked through her medical records and I saw her sexual assault had happened on this date, and she started immediately having suffering from severe headaches. She started going to the clinic, she started taking, getting stuff prescribed. And that marker is what because she had been denied originally. And so I said, we need to revisit, we need to ask them to rethink and revisit this claim without it going to appeal. Because when we started, her file was so thick. And when we started digging through that, we started seeing the medical conditions that arose after the sexual
That
assault.
happened
And
to
I
her.
was able to work with the veteran service officer to pull all that out of her medical records and her personnel records. She started having trouble at work. And we said, these are the many, many markers in this woman's file that show that she went from being a model soldier to somebody who was constantly sick, who was having issues at work, who maybe her uniform wasn't in order. And so we were able to successfully get her claim approved. But too often, the veteran service officer, who is the frontline person to do that right, is doesn't do it well. And I always say, you can go in and do it yourself, but I always, always, always tell veterans, don't try to do it yourself. Just go to a veteran service officer, go to somebody who's skilled and experienced in doing this. And the other thing that I remind people is, even if you don't have a sexual assault related service connection, you can still go to treatment at VA for free. You can go to the Veterans Center. You can go and get a psychologist. All you have to do is say, I experienced sexual assault or harassment or rape in the military and I need to be seen. And they will see you. And that actually helps your case later, because there's documentation and diagnosis.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and I know we were this question, you have answers for it, but the thing is, are they listening? Are the right people listening? But I'm going to ask you anyway. Um, so as I was saying, and you have mentioned them a few times, well, practically, or just make it concrete, like what are the most common barriers that you face when seeking support um, for survivors?
And I think for survivors, both non-veteran and veteran, the most
Mm.
common barrier is shame, because everything that you read, when you read about, I can't tell you how many times, even today, I read on social media, well, she should have just left.
Okay, the
If it were
victim.
that simple, think he would. And it's really the shame. I did something wrong. I didn't leave. I I invited him into my hotel room. It's the shame, and it's not just internalized shame. We feel that in the way people ask questions. We feel
Yeah.
it in the way people talk to us when they say, "Well, were you out drinking that night?" That's
Mm.
irrelevant. It does not matter if a woman or a man was drinking. What matters is that a person committed a crime, did something they were not supposed to do. That's what we need. We need to shift that conversation from what she did to make it happen to the act that was committed that is illegal. That 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 needs to be our focus. And so I think shame is one of the biggest barriers, and
Mm.
fear that, my mom was sexually assaulted from the age of 9 to 15. And then she married my dad, who was an alcoholic, and we suspect abusive, although we don't know. But she told me one time, that she went to a healthcare provider, and basically he implied that it was her fault, and that her post traumatic stress was all in her head. So she left, and she never again sought out a therapist ever
Mm.
for the rest of it. And that was when she was in her 40s, and she lived until she was, in her like almost 90. And um and and so she carried that burden on her own her entire life, because she was ashamed. She felt it was her fault. It was all in her head. There was nothing wrong with her. All of the stigma that goes with mental health in conditions, or concerns, or behavioral health, or whatever, in this country, all of that stigma prevents people from seeking help. And then there's, I've talked to women who said, my husband doesn't know. My husband today doesn't know what happened to me. And if I start going to therapy, he's going to find out. And I'm going to have that conversation with him. And so women bear this burden alone too often. So I always encourage women, sexual assault and domestic violence crisis centers have one job, and they do it exceptionally well because they've got decades of experience behind them. And that is to provide support and assistance to survivors and victims. And many of them have offered groups and therapy at no cost to the survivor or victim. And so really that can be a great place to start. And then of course there's the insurance. If you don't have insurance, how can you get care? How can you get the mental health services that you need? How can you go to a doctor and get a diagnosis? And so those barriers can be substantial. And for women who are in the military or who are veterans, it's very much the same. It's shame, it's fear. It's fear that if I apply for this claim and I'm denied, that's the VA saying it didn't happen to me. And 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 when we're talking, one of the things that my hope with this book was that women would feel validated, that they would hear their story or read their story, and it would offer them some validation that everything that's happened to them, that everything that they're feeling, that everything that's been a part of their life, whether it's been 1 year or 60 years, that it's real, and it's okay to say it, and it's there's not something wrong with them. It's the nature of this beast.
Yeah. 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 Thank you. Shame is, yeah, I agree with you. All the barriers. That's what the other side of the conversation. Sometimes when men that I know are, trying to counter argue or trying to minimize the extent of gender-based violence, because that's the underlying yeah issue, factor, whether violence, physical violence, emotional violence, or intimate partner violence or sexual violence. When I try to minimize the extent, the prevalence of that, sometimes, especially if it's a person that I know, that I know your loved one, I can be like, because people will confide in you if they find you safe. So shame is one barrier that people don't come for unless they find a safe person or a safe space. So, being a safe space, after I shared some years ago when I broke silence, and then, I became like a safe person. And then you go back in the community, and then you hear men negate that. And sometimes I think, you don't even realize, coming to your statement about women saying, my partner doesn't even know this thing happened to me. And then you listen to some of these men, and then you be like, you don't even know the person you probably staying with. Three women in your family may have, one out of every three women in your family. You just do not know because they don't share it with you. It may have been your sister, it may be your mother, it may be your spouse. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm the one who out here, I'm loud about it, so I'm talking, but I didn't name your loved one. So you think that no, it happened to aliens. Yeah, that's not true. And it's even at a little, yeah, at a minimum rate. So they
Yeah.
don't get the extent to which this thing is pervasive. Like right in a household, but because they are not the one that these things are shared
Yeah.
with. Yeah,
Yeah.
so when I
And
was telling you that we have a noon day, and the space where we even include men is so that they can be a part of some of these conversation, and know that, and know some of these issues.
I think it's invaluable. I've had some male friends when I post things who say, "Yeah, women, you women need to fix that. You women need to fight." I'm like, Okay, we have been fighting. Women have been fighting this for generations. It's time for men to start fighting it. It's time for men to turn to their male counterparts and say, no, no, what you're doing is not okay. What he's doing, what you said, they need to step up because we're tired. And we have been doing the work. We have built the shelters. We have trained the advocates. We have been there for women after a severe beating or a sexual assault. We have done the work. We have sat in front of Congress and spoken. It's time for men who care for us and otherwise to take a stand on our behalf, to go and speak to Congress, even if it's never happened to them, and say this has got to end. It's time. My ex, one time I had a friend who was being severely battered. She called me. It was the middle of the night. I went. He wouldn't go. My ex laid in bed and wouldn't go. He said, and I swear to you, this is what he said. He knows all the best hunting spots. If I go and confront him, he'll stop taking me. And I said, so you would rather you're going to sacrifice her so
Mhm.
you can go find a place to shoot an animal.
Mhm.
I would, and when I showed up, his stepfather was sitting in the car at the street going, come on, get in the, he wasn't, the guy was holding a 2x4 to hit her when I showed up. And I'm the one who went up to him and intervened, who got between him and her. His stepfather sat his butt in the car and did nothing. And so, yeah, no, it's not all men, but men are the ones who are doing the majority of the deed. They're the
Yeah,
ones who are the problem. Women are being hurt by when women are assaulted and raped and beaten. Too often, it's men. So yes, men have to be in the fight because if they're not in the fight, if they're not doing something about it, if the men in the military refuse to take action when the men under them or next to them are sexually assaulting and harming people, that's their fault, and they need to be the ones to change that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Seriously.
I'm glad
And
today, I'm glad today has that sort of program design. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is, you may not even know your yeah. The point was, you may not even know your daughter, because just she didn't explain to you doesn't mean that someone, just your loved one, is not being hurt by the same system, because it's systemic, that you're trying to
Yep.
uphold by doing nothing, because you want to keep the broco. You don't want to offend your fellow man. I mean, that's just being cowardice, and I know this. It goes to even what I say about pastors. Like, I've told a few of my that are close to that. We send women back and say, well, let her just go back home. You're so afraid as a pastor to even confront your fellow men, like to talk about your church member, but you expect a woman to endure that, to go back in as something. Who's the coward here? You know? But
Yeah.
then you
Exactly.
stigmatize the woman when she leaves the marriage. So yeah, so
Yeah.
we need to recognize that this is systemic, and it perpetuates because certain people refuse to act.
Exactly. And I think, it's important to talk about, what all that looks like. What, is domestic violence? Does it only include hitting, or is it bigger? It's bigger. And when we talk about sexual assault, we talk about sexual assault outside relationships, and we talk about sexual assault inside relationships. And that's part of intimate partner violence. So when we talk about intimate partner violence, that includes sexual assault. It includes emotional, mental, physical, sexual, economic. It includes all of that. And we're
Mm.
not talking about a fight. We're talking about something that is a pattern, and that is continuous. And I hate when I hear on TV or on anything when somebody says they got into a fight. They weren't fighting. He was beating the hell out of her. Let's be very clear about that. That is not a fight. And
Oh my
so I think that there's a lot with our language that needs to change too. Like you said at the beginning, let's call, like, the VA came up with the phrase of military sexual trauma because they didn't want to have to say harassment, assault, and rape that occurred in the
Yeah,
military.
MST.
And yeah, and MST is not the event. It's MST isn't what happened to you. You were assaulted, raped, or harassed. MST is what you have as a result of that experience. And so
Yeah.
I think it's very important that we get our language right.
So, Liz, you've just gone through the questions, and I didn't even have to ask you, like, what role should government and institutions play in addressing military sexual assault and domestic violence? And you talk about them, especially using the military. You talk about them putting structure of check and balance in place in a system of accountability, especially for senior officers. And then the next question was, how can community, friends, and family better support trauma survivors? And you and I have been going on about men, especially men, joining the advocacy or the fight. Because mainly it's men that perpetuate these kind of violence against other people. And the next line was the power of storytelling. How does media shape how we perceive survivors in their healing journey? So you started already with language, language, language. So we on
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for the listeners to also, I think we also need to talk about race and LGBTQ and immigration status. Those can be barriers. Women of color and Native women are more likely to be sexually assaulted, especially in the military. That's a reality. The racism is part and parcel of that of violence. It's
Racism,
gender
sexism.
based, but it's also race based, and I think it's really important for people when they're thinking about it to really recognize and understand, and the unraveling of DEI that this administration has done has been harmful to women of color, more so, and to LGBTQ women. I think it's I think what they're doing with uh, uh, demeaning and deriding trans people is absolutely dangerous. The lesbians I know who are military and veteran are are really seriously being impacted by this. That the fear and the concern for their fellow women, and so we really have to we have to talk about that. And when we talk about the military, men are enlisting at a lower rate than women. Women are enlisting at the highest rate, and Black women in particular. And so we really have to talk about the reality of the fact that they get fewer promotions, that they are more likely to be sexually assaulted. They experience racism. Yes, there is racism in the United States military, kids. Let's have that conversation. Let's have that conversation alongside the conversation about military sexual assault and harassment. Because oftentimes when women of color are harassed, it's not just sexual, but it's how they're sexualized and it's race. And these all affect women when they get out of the military. While they're in, it affects their decision to stay. Women are enlisting at a higher rate, but they're also discharging at a higher rate because of the sexual assault and discrimination in the military. And if we want readiness, we have to address those issues. We have to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God, Lace, I could just talk to you forever. What do you? I know. I'm just going to encourage the audience to
Great.
just check your work, and then, yeah, Lace is going to be as part of her book tour. She's going to be coming to Arizona. Um, April, right? So I'm looking forward to seeing her and then doing some work with her to put a book out there. So I'm going to share about it if you want a copy to get a copy for yourself. But also in the meantime, you can check out her LinkedIn page. She's done a lot of work and writing, uh, and she's vocal. I mean, Liz is vocal when it comes to yeah. She's worked in
True.
this system for 30 years, so she knows. So she's like, it can be so. I mean, it comes through your writing. It comes through. If someone's reading your frustration, this why is the system, why is the VA, why are people not being treated? We have the resources, we know what needs to be done. Or if we don't know, yeah, our ways, yeah, people have done this from the UK. You usually will share this kind of report and say we can borrow from here and then improve our system. Why are we failing to do it? Because there is no political will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
So, what responsibility do journalists, authors, and you already started? And I know there are some authors that are also that are writing on it, but to a large extent, what responsibility should journalists, authors, and media outlets have in amplifying survivor voices?
And I'm glad you asked that question. Journalists have a lot of responsibility. Uh, Like I said, language. We How many headlines have we seen where they say, woman found dead, and then in the article you found out he killed her. Let's say woman killed by her husband.
Oh my
Like
God.
let's talk. Let's use the words that we were giving and stop trying to find words substitutes that because we worry about upsetting men by saying the truth. We worry about everything, but let's start being honest about how we talk about this. With Vanessa Guillen, we saw a lot of language, and I can't think of it right off the top of my head, but I remember reading some of those articles and saying, why are you trying to make it sound prettier than it is? Like, why are you not being honest? And I think that
Yeah,
honesty,
you know what it
that
is.
yeah, calling it what it is. Let's name the puppy. And yet we are so hesitant to do that. And journalists are hesitant to, you see inaccurate headlines. I don't know how many times I've crossed something out and said, there, I fixed it. You know, like after a fight, this happened to her. No, it wasn't after a fight. It was after an incident of violence committed against her. And the other thing about journalists is let's stop let's stop worrying about saying it happens to men too. Let's stop. We know it does. Let's stop worrying. But when we talk about breast cancer, that happens to men too. 5% of victims of or people who have breast cancer are men. When we talk about breast cancer, we don't say it happens to men too. And it's not negating their experiences, but let's be okay with talking about violence against women, gender-based violence. Let's be okay with that.
Without being
And let's
defensive.
be honest. Yeah, without being defensive. And let's talk about how race is a part of that, and how especially if a woman of color is sexually assaulted and the offender is white, how that looks different in whether or not she gets justice. And I think that, that when journalists talk about this, they have to start being more upfront and honest about it. And when if it's a Black offender, they talk about him as if the court's already decided he's guilty. Whereas if it's a white offender, they use the word alleged. He's the alleged offender. And so let's start using equal language when we talk about sexual assault and domestic violence. And also, let's not be hesitant to have those honest articles. For a journalist to say, here's the latest report on sexual assault in the military. It hasn't gone down. It hasn't changed. Here's a report on sexual assault in colleges, and colleges are not doing what they should be doing to address it. We had a woman when I was at Columbia who was literally carrying a mattress around with her to make sure that what happened to her, because Columbia University had glossed it over. She wanted to bring awareness, and that mattress, lugging that mattress all over campus, was her way of making sure that it was in people's minds that this was happening at an Ivy League university and the Ivy League was doing nothing about it. And so journalists have a lot of responsibility that they're shirking. But journalists like you, who are not mainstream, are doing that hard work that should be acknowledged and congratulated and awarded.
Yeah. Thank you. Unfortunately, yeah, because they make it really unfortunate. It shouldn't be, but unfortunately, the media is male dominated, so it's male centered. So people don't want to hurt male feelings. Yeah, but Roxanne Gay, and she wrote an article some years back, that addressing that the violence of language, and I've shared where she talked about, the 12-year-old being raped by this white athlete, but then the media was more concerned about painted this great picture about his future. He was going to do this and the university, the benefit. Yeah, at the expense of a 12-year-old Black little girl, sacrifice her well-being. But it was all about, how it's going to mess up this great athlete future, and then what he stood for, and this and that. So the media has that violence of language when it comes to women, and then particularly when it comes to Black or women or people of color, and gender non-conforming, non-binary people. That's what I keep saying. People,
Exactly.
not just women.
That's exactly right. And it also has the effect of continuing to cause them harm after the incident happens. And it prevents women and people who are non-binary and gender non-conforming from talking about what happened to them, from reporting it, because they know that they're the ones who are going to be assaulted, that the guy who is the lieutenant colonel, or the guy who is the athlete, or the white, like women know for a fact that the media is going to come out against them as the victims and hard on the side of the people who did the harm. And if it's a white man, and that continues to do harm to all the survivors and victims. the fact that like that institutional betrayal, which when you think about it with the media, that's a huge example of institutional betrayal. That
Yeah, it is.
it's a different way to look at institutional betrayal, not the standard institutional betrayal, but it is nevertheless that has an overwhelming negative impact on survivors and victims.
Yeah, yeah. The media, they honestly, the media doesn't try at all when it comes to, people who suffer violence or people who suffer misfortune. Um, yeah, I always had a problem, and they at that, especially those who did not. I don't know whether they didn't do trauma sensitive reporting, or they just don't care. I mean, someone is just recovering, or someone's in the middle of a traumatic situation, and people will have microphone at their mouth and be asking them to explain. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So what then? So what happened? Yeah. So go ahead, and I'm like, Lord, really, seriously.
It's true. I mean, we saw it when there was a conversation about the young 10-year-old girl who was raped and ended up pregnant. We saw how the journalists failed so miserably in talking about that. So, let's put the responsibility that belongs on them squarely on their shoulders.
Okay, so as we wrap our looking ahead list, what do you hope readers take away? Oh, you already said that. What do you hope reader will take away? But at the end of the program, so that it remains in our mind, what do you hope readers take away from your book? And then what's next for you? Oh, I know you're on your way here, but what do you hope we take away? And then what's next for you?
So I hope that readers who are survivors and victims, and even though it's about women, because that's the sum of my experience, men who have and non-conforming people people will have something that they can take away from this book. People who have post-traumatic stress, I think, will have something that they can take away from this book. For women who are victims and survivors, I think it will offer some validation of everything that they have felt and done. And for people who are in the helping fields, who are first responders, who are advocates, who are medical providers, I hope it
Mm,
help gives them a little more clarity and understanding how to more compassionately and accurately deal with survivors and victims. And at the end of the book, I added some documents. One is called "Becoming a Trauma Informed Workplace," and another one is "Becoming a Safe Workplace." Like how do when and it gives steps. It's not end all be all. One of the things I recommend to people is finding a good consultant who can work with them on these issues. But it gives them a thing to look at to think, oh, I haven't done that in my workplace, or that's not really what I'm doing in my workplace. I talk about what does trauma informed mean. So I hope people can who are it's for really everybody. It's from the victim all the way to people who are helpers, business owners, etc. They can all learn something from this book. And for
yeah.
me, what's next? I start my book tour. I leave Oregon March 23rd. The first stop is in Indianapolis, and I'm trying to get all of my stops posted this week. I've pretty much got a lot of stuff between Indianapolis and Florida, and then I've got things in Texas in the beginning of May, like the end of April, and then on to Florida and up to California. And then I'm taking this summer to just kind of do stuff in the Pacific Northwest and not work maybe. And then in August and September, I'm going to do a second part of my tour, which is going to do the northern states and the center part of the United States. And then at some point, I'm going to start on my second book. I've already got it started. I guess I should say I'm going to finish my second book. So
Yeah.
that's what's up for me.
Okay. Okay. Then what about our listeners? Because you mentioned light workers and people who advocates and people providing help. So what's about our listener? How can our listeners take action to support trauma survivors and advocate for change?
And I think the biggest thing is believe them. You know,
Yeah.
when a there's the myth that women are lying when they talk about it, and that is a myth. It's so few people lie about that. More people lie about having their wallets stolen than lie about sexual assault. But if somebody tells you that they were attacked on the street and their wallet was stolen, you don't have trouble believing them. You don't say, "Well, what were you doing?" Like you go, "Oh my God, that was terrible. You must have been so traumatic." So believing them is really the first step, and asking them. Over my 30 years, the thing I used to say to people is, "Tell me what I need to know to help you." I didn't I didn't demand they tell me their stories. I didn't try to fill in gaps for them. I said, "Tell me what I need to know to help you." And then I listened. I had a yellow pad. One of the things I used to hear from women veterans was when I'm talking to my doctor or my therapist, they're not looking at me. They're looking at the computer typing, and I feel like they're not listening. Look at a person. When a person who is a survivor or a victim is talking to you, look at them. Let them know that you're acknowledging them. And avoid phrases that sound blaming. Whatever you do, avoid phrases that sound blaming or like you're skeptical and you don't believe them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Liz. So yeah, audience, this is a thank you, Liz, for joining us today. Any final thing that I did not cover that you want to, any parting comments, or you're done?
No, I think we've done a good job of covering it. Thank you so much, Priscilla. I really appreciate you and you having me here and the work that you're doing with the New Day and journalists. I can't thank you enough because it's so important. And congratulations. I mean, good luck on the pursuit of your degree. We need more good social workers in this world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on the New Day. Thank you for being a change and for sharing your day with us. Thank you. Sometimes when I see you share something, especially, the VA has released the statistics about the number of female veterans that are homeless have decreased, and then you will share content, and then like where the VA take that statistic from. This is what is showing that there are more female that are homeless and need support, and we need the resources. And I can be like, and then I'll go and read the report, and it's really detailed and accurate because I'll compare with other places. I'll read, check it out, verify, and I'll be like, Liz is doing a good job just holding our system accountable. And holding duty bearers accountable. So thank you for all that you do. So yeah, viewers, thank you for joining us as well. Let's continue the dialogue and elevate our voices and actively participate in shaping a world where social justice isn't an aspiration alone but a reality. Join us next time on a new day as we continue to explore and advocate for social reform. Remember, change begins with a conversation. Let's make every day a new day for progress. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. And Liz, the link to her website, I just shared it, and her bio is also here, and a summary of the book is also there. I'll continue to share. Please look out. The book is going to come out in March, around the 18th, and we will share that. But we wish Liz all the best as she continues to advocate to make our world a better place. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye, man.
Bye.
My name is Abina Johnson, and this is Focus on Liberia. Hit it! From Cape Mount to Cape Palmo, Mount Nimba to Atlantic Ocean.